Welcome back. It's Unit 4, Lecture 3. This is early 20th century sculpture and design. I've pared this down for the purpose of summary. There are more examples in the lecture on Blackboard, which is true for all the videos, of course. We're going to look primarily right now at the work of the sculptor Brancusi. We want to also take a look at the work of Garrett Wrightveld. The style that Wrightveld is known for as a designer is called de stijl. Translates from the Dutch to English as literally the style, but think of it capital T, capital S, the style. The idea was to create a universal style that could be appreciated by anyone, anywhere. Wrightveld's designs work perfectly with the paintings that I want you to know on, and you'll recognize those, I think, when you see them. We'll also look at the Bauhaus today. So to look at the work of Brancusi, weirdly, we have to look at the work. On this slide, you actually have 3 different sculptures, 1 by Rodin, 2 by Brancusi, all of them called The Kiss. It's remarkable to think that the artwork of just a couple of decades earlier, the piece on the left there dates from 1898, on the right just a few years 1912, you can see how radically art is beginning to change from post-impressionism to this new modern style. Now, weirdly, Brancusi the opportunity to become a studio assistant to Rodin and passed it up, and you can kind of see why, I think. What Rodin started in terms of reducing things, remember Walking Man, where he didn't include the head or the arms of the figure? It was much more abstract. Brancusi wants to push even further than that. These works are really where he shines. And what you see here on the left is a sculpture that suggests a female torso, as if there's an arm and hand kind of that the head is leaning into. If you look for the sort of bridge of the eyebrow to the nose, the suggestion of lips, you can sort of see it. The image on the right is a little bit more fully non-objectively abstract, and that's the piece I want us to know for the test. Brancusi's Bird in Space. Now that doesn't look like a depiction of a specific type of bird. Students that I've had in other classes, they could see bird-like things about it, that it reminded one student very much of just a feather. Others said that they could see wings, particularly wings of seabirds like gulls. Some others said they sort of saw the shape of a beak. If you imagine the bird maybe diving into water, you kind of see a bird-like shape there as well. But I always think that there's an amazing aspect of the movement of the line of that piece from leaping up into the air, which I associate very much with how quickly a bird can take flight. Whichever way you interpret it, it allows all of us to see this piece in our own way or from our own point of view. But what to me is kind of remarkable about it is it's so abstract. It doesn't say a bird. It doesn't look like the thing it is representing. So when it was sent to the US for an exhibition, when the customs officials were processing that were being shipped, they thought it was a machine part rather than a piece of art. It was that kind of foreign to the American audience that the piece was made. The piece dates from 1928. Other artists are beginning to do different things with sculpture. Making it be able to move is something kind of new for. So sculpture that can move, the term for that is kinetic as opposed to static. Static works stay still. Probably the most famous American Alexander Calder. He created 2 large bodies of works. These that are hinged to move are known as mobiles, and he called the ones that wouldn't move stabiles, or mobile and stable. That's kind of an interesting way of categorizing what he does. But they're playful, they're fun, they're bright. Kids tend to love them. I included a video in your discussion board area on Calder's circus. Calder actually created sculptures out of wire and other rigged to move that he would perform with for kids, almost like a puppet show. Kind of an amazing career. Speaking of interesting careers, this is the work of the English sculptor Henry Moore. And Henry Moore lived in London during the Blitz, during the Second World War, when the citizens of London would sometimes take shelter from the German air raids in the subway tunnels. And that's what you see there in the photograph at the left, and his drawings that he experiences on the right, his sculptures very much look like abstracted, reclining human forms. And if you look at the way he drew and recorded those events, you can kind of see in the abstract forms where those curves and more horizontal forms are coming from. Kind of remarkable work. The Russians also are pushing further into the areas of abstraction. This style is known as Suprematism, practitioner of which is Casimir Malevich. And Malevich starts out doing something that feels kind of like the German expressionist work we looked at, geometric shapes that suggest forms in an oblique way. This is meant to be figures walking in snow in a small village, but it's mostly just rectangles and triangles, white and blue and black, which becomes this kind of language here a few years later, triangle, square, simple color, and evolves to this white on white painting that is definitely one of the most famous pieces of the suprematist movement. Another Russian style is Constructivism. This comes evolution. The work that you're seeing here is a model for an architectural structure that was never actually built. It was called the Third International Tower. It was actually meant to house three different public communications outlets. There was television projection through it, radio, and print media. The idea, though, was that the building itself would have three different levels that would be rotating. So this base level that you see inside here, that level would rotate one full rotation per year. Was meant to rotate once per month, and the top section once per day. Kind of a remarkable idea, but never really worked. Garrett Wrightveld is our designer of the Stil, the style, coming to us from Holland. And you can see some design features here that are actually common to the way we live today. The that might did in architecture show open floor plans and multi-use rooms. That's pretty much how we live today. We don't have dining rooms, kitchens very often are great rooms that have a living room feeling to them. That's really what the Stil artists were doing as far back as the 20s. You can see that he's using geometric shapes, straight lines, and just the primary colors, red, yellow, and white. Of course, what's happening in this painting by Mondrian. I want you to know this one, composition with red, blue, and yellow. Now, quite frankly, I'll show this painting sometimes and students idiot could do that. Well, okay, probably. Very few people do actually make work like this without seeing it first, but okay, it's simple. Where did it come from? Well, to me, one of the things about the piece that's exciting is that he does use all of the basic building blocks in any painting. Paintings generally use lines and shapes and colors, right? So we've got black lines, we've got white shapes, and the colors that are filling in the other shapes are what? The primaries, red, yellow, blue. Those are the three you need to make everything else if you also include. So it may be actually a little deeper than it seems on the surface. But again, a lot of times people will say, well, this wouldn't take skill to make. With that skill, that's an incredibly detailed, beautiful drawing of a chrysanthemum, and it's by the very same artist. So abstraction is not for lack of skill. Abstraction is a choice. And look at how he arrived at it. Here are some paintings that show you what look kind of a expressionist fauve style of painting a tree at the top left that becomes simplified to lines and a grid on the right, and see the transition from the tree to the painting we just saw. Kind of a remarkable idea about reducing and taking away detail, something simple. And again, this is why you take a class with a lecture base instead of just reading a book. The book just shows you Mondrian painting, but not how he got there. Speaking of how we get from one place to another, from one style to another, we have to take a look. The Bauhaus was an art, architecture, and design school. It flourished in Germany. It actually was in two separate locations by the Nazis. But when you look at these photographs, you're probably thinking that those are pretty basic, simple buildings. They look kind of like dormitories. style buildings on a college campus. And yeah, they definitely do. But up until this point, most architects were not creating buildings that were this being just pure geometric shapes with exposed materials like the steel and glass and concrete. Most architects were still trying to decorate things sort of in the way that we saw with Louis Sullivan at the end of the last unit, with lots of decorative detail, not quite sculpted, carved and patterned detail, and suggestions of things from classical architecture like the columns and entablature and so forth. What you're seeing here is actually an attempt to create a purely simplistic, universal, simple, clean, and easy style of design, and that's very much what the Bauhaus architects believed that there should be no barrier between fine art and craft, or between architecture, painting, and sculpture. Those things contributed to providing people with good and decent lives. They also believed things should be affordable and that people should have well-designed things even if they were poor. Now, that kind of democracy, that kind of idealism did not sit well with Hitler. So the Nazis definitely the Bauhaus down, and in fact they did. Many Bauhaus teachers left Germany and came to the United States. They taught at major universities, the best architecture programs in the country, but also some of them taught here in North Carolina at Black Mountain College in Asheville. Joseph Albers, the painting teacher in particular, came to us to teach these new modern ideas. I wanted you to just see an example of the difference in attitude and our style of education today. Now, obviously, we don't really use those worksheets that you see on the left anymore. That's sort of the old style format that we used to use for advising, but it's very similar to what you get in WebAdvisor, which tells you what classes you have to take, and then when you're done, it closes those. Have them anymore. The thing that always struck me as interesting, though, is that we have our English classes writing in a separate class, and that's where your art history class would go, is right in here in your humanities. But your writing and your reading are somehow different from speech, separate. Art history would go here, and that's separate from real history. These are your social sciences. All of that separate from real science, math, and then there's everything else. In the Bauhaus style, everything's a circle. Instead of separate, it's connected. And the course structure from the outside in, the preliminary course includes everything and then gets more specific as we go toward the ultimate goal, not architecture, but building. So whether you're a painter primarily, or a clothing designer, or an architect, you're building these things for people. Fascinating. Instead of a painting class, there's a course in color. So if you're a textile designer or an architect or a painter, you still take the same course, but go it from your own particular discipline. This is the Bauhaus Manifesto as it was published. Our instructor who teaches German, Ms. Shin, prepared these slides for a lecture she gave. She graciously allowed me to borrow them. I just wanted you to see some of the attitudes of the Bauhaus in their manifesto, that the ultimate goal of all creative activity is the act of building. And they meant that whether you were a painter, an architect, or a designer. Architects, sculptors, painters, we must all return to craftsmanship, to working by hand. Let us then create a new guild of craftsmen without the class division that wanted to erect an arrogant wall between craftsman and artist. That's democratic an approach for the Nazis, don't you think? But it's a beautiful goal. It really does give us the idea that they wanted unity between people. Let us desire, conceive, and create the new building of the future that will unite all, architecture and sculpture and painting, and it will rise up to the heavens of craftsmen as a crystal clear symbol of a new belief to come. They really were trying to create a better world through art and design, which I think is a beautiful goal. And the designs look super modern. That would look great in right now. And that design was made in 1925. One of my favorite aspects of the Brewer chairs designed by Marcel Brewer, the material they're made from is pretty simple, leather and aluminum. But look at the size of that aluminum tubing. You might actually recognize that particular tubing because that's pretty standard sized bicycle frame tubing. That's what it's made from. The company that produces tubing shapes it to the needs of its clients. So you could just as easily shape the bike tubing into a chair as into a bicycle. And that's really what the Bauhaus designers were about. Easy access to easily repeatable materials that could be produced elegant. Awesome work. The designers also generally worked on not only furniture and painting and so forth, on architecture. Ludwig Mies van der Rohe not only designed work when he was living in Germany, but when he had to flee, he came to the United States and designed similar work here, with walls on the exterior that are almost entirely glass, are very, very typical of that Bauhaus design style. And that looks like it could be a high-end showroom for selling products. It could be a museum. It could be a classroom space. You get the sense of utilitarian usefulness from the even be living spaces. This is Ludwig van der Rohe design for apartment buildings. And the thing about them that's kind of awesome, yeah, they're simple, but they don't have any of that fussy, weird stuff that we saw in Unit 3 that Louis Sullivan was doing. But they also allow very clean statement of purpose. They definitely show their function in their form. I think that Sullivan would have appreciated that. My favorite aspect was that because they're so huge and they would take up a lot of space, on the ground level, if you were walking around the outside, notice that that ground level is pretty much open, except for a smaller lobby area in glass. You can walk underneath the building and continue on your way. You can see that opening right in through here. So strangely, float above the ground. This is a van der Rohe design for a guest house on a larger property with a more dwelling on it as well. It's a glass house. There's curtains there that can close it off for privacy, but what a beautiful way to be in nature. And yet here's a van der Rohe design with Philip Johnson, an American architect, very much the same design idea of these floating things. The concept of this design philosophy is less is more. I like the idea that they're going for simplicity. I love the fact that van der Rohe is not only designing the building, but the furniture that's designed to go with it. Color-wise, they certainly look like they would belong together. This is what we would call style architecture. Here's a Philip Johnson design, an American using this Bauhaus structure. This is probably the most famous glass guest house in this style. It absolutely is a beautiful structure that would allow you to appreciate nature while being still safe within the indoor space. Awesome. There's a shot from the inside with some typical Bauhaus furniture. It would really be a kind of nice place to spend a weekend. The last image I want you to see here from the Bauhaus is Joseph Albers' work, and his work is very much based on the interactions of color. He did dozens of images of a square inside of a square, all with different color changes between those shapes to really purely explore the possibilities of all of the different interactions of different spatial effect and emotional effect. We should also respect him for coming to America and teaching these kind of avant-garde design ideas at Black Mountain College, which was sort of America's answer to the Bauhaus in Asheville, North Carolina.